have a long history with cassette tape. I remember vividly that Christmas in the late 1960s when us boys each received a Kmart Calamar-tronic brand shoebox-sized cassette recorder kit.
I've been working for about the last 2 weeks on an idea for a video, and I'm kind of stuck. And the video is really comprised of maybe 2 or 3 different stories that are kind of interrelated, but not totally related. And now I'm thinking the dilemma that I'm having in trying to make the video is itself part of the story. So I started about a week and a half ago, or maybe 2 weeks ago, thinking about this story, and I drafted 4-page typed, spaced 1.5 lines, a rough script for this video. Now, I normally don't script my videos at all, but I thought this was complicated enough and enough different information in it that I really needed it to be organized. And so I did this rough draft. I redline edited the draft, and then I retyped it, single spaced down to 3-page script. And then I started shooting some footage, began last Sunday and into Monday, and spent 2 days sitting at the computer editing, shooting more footage, and finally came to the conclusion last night that this just isn't ready for prime time.
I can vividly feel the firmness of those steak fry-sized buttons that you'd press to operate the device.
Since I was a kid, I've been interested in and a user of audio cassette tapes. Not just playing back pre-recorded music tapes, but I mean actually recording audio tapes. And a lot of it wasn't music. It wasn't mixtapes. Mostly never was mixtapes. It was almost all spoken word stuff. Stories, ideas, like audio journals, kind of radio story kind of stuff. Different things like this I've been messing around with. And it goes all the way back to the maybe late 1960s when for Christmas one year, my folks bought me a Kmart Calamar-tronic cassette recorder, and it's what is now called a shoebox recorder because the form factor of the recorder is roughly the shape and size of a shoebox. And my other 2 brothers each got one for their own. So we had these tape recorders around the house when I was young, and we just enjoyed the heck out of recording just, our playing, our talking, interviewing each other, pretending like we were detectives, pretending like we were secret agents, telling radio stories, interviewing relatives. We did all this stuff on tape and just loved it. And I've recently acquired a modern remake of this shoebox-sized recorder. That's another part of the story I'll get into in a little bit. But back to the 1970s now. Later in the 1970s, I discovered microcassette recorders. And here is a tape from the late 1970s. I'm thinking this is about 1979 maybe. There's the tape inside the container. And I bought an Iowa microcassette recorder, which I don't have anymore, but I still have one of these. This is actually a Radio Shack brand, but I think it's made by Olympus. But so I still use microcassettes also. I've used microcassettes up through from the late 70s up until the present era. There's an old tape on this one from 1979. It still plays. So that's part of the story, is these super low fidelity formats that were never intended to be used for music, really just like dictation, seem to last surprisingly long, 40 years. That's part of the story. So that's one side of it, the personal part of the story, my history with magnetic tape, with compact and micro cassette tapes. So the other part of the story is that I've noticed in the news media recently in the United States, there has been a lot of use of the word tape in the news. And this is in relation to a lawyer named Michael Cohen, who was Donald Trump's personal attorney back during the campaign for president in 2016 and earlier. But during that 2016 campaign, apparently Mr. Cohen had surreptitiously recorded conversations with Mr. Trump in some kind of format. And now the presence of these recordings is being discussed openly in the media, and what are all the ramifications, et cetera, et cetera. But without getting any more into the politics of it, suffice it to say that the word tape is being used to refer to these recordings. And this word tape has been thrown around in the media for decades. And you can go all the way back to the most notable historical example, of course, was the Watergate conspiracy. And that involved literal tape where President Nixon had a Sony reel-to-reel tape recorder set up in his office, in the Oval Office, and he was recording conversations of people visiting him, which became known as the Watergate tapes. So the word tape has been thrown around for decades, and it's being used in the media even now. And what interests me about this is the two parts of this coming together is my personal side, my personal history of using actual magnetic tape for recording, and the other side is tape is being discussed as having been used, but it's not, probably not really tape.
It's magnetism after the magnetizing force has been removed. Frequency equals 1/period.
So that was the tape from the late 1970s. My friend Paul, he had borrowed this the older micro cassette player I had, he had borrowed it and used it to dictate notes to himself as he was reading and studying for his second class petty officer exam. But he had set the recorder to the 1.2 centimeter per second speed, the ultra low speed, which is the lowest resolution of this low resolution format. And so it was a lot of tape hits, but also he didn't speak very loudly because I think he was lying in his rack, in his bunk on ship at night, reading through this book, and he was kind of speaking softly into the microphone so he wouldn't disturb anybody. So it was a confluence of three different things that you don't want to do with this kind of low-end format, but he ended up using it, and 40 years later, this tape still plays. The information on the tape is still accessible. It may not be high fidelity though. So, microcassette, it's a wonderful format for just recording your thoughts, dictating thoughts. It doesn't really have the fidelity for broadcast unless that kind of low resolution effect is part of what you're trying to say, let's say. This is just one example of what I was using microcassette for, kind of an audible note-taking device. Getting back to the shoebox format recorders back in the late 60s that we got for Christmas, I recently went on the search for one of these units to have so I can play regular size compact tapes. And this is kind of the third story. We talked about the personal side, the political side of tape. This is the third part of the story. This part is the fact that I went looking online and I ended up buying through B&H Photo this Caliphone brand, and Caliphone is a brand that makes equipment for auditoriums and PA systems and kind of educational presentations. It's standard bias tape. There's no noise reduction. It's automatic record level control, so you have very little control. It's essentially the same kind of device that we had back in the late 1960s, the very low budget Kmart units that my dad bought us. So there it is, and it's even powered by, yes, C-cell batteries.
That says Richard Milhouse Nixon. I couldn't find a Sony 800D reel-to-reel tape recorder, so I decided to get me a little cheap-ass little cassette recorder from the year 2018, way in the future after I'm dead and gone. Don't ask me how I did it.
You know, there's this thing called the suspension of disbelief, which is kind of how all film and TV shows work. You know, we pretend like they're not actors. We pretend like they're real people. And you kind of have to suspend your disbelief to believe that Michael Cohen was using tape to record his conversations with Mr. Trump. So that's kind of what I want to do, is take the the media at their word, literally, that it was tape, and pretend like, okay, let's say he was using tape. Was he using a dictaphone, kind of like this, a microcassette player? Did he have it hidden in his jacket pocket? Maybe he had a little external microphone plugged in, a little lapel mic hidden under his lapel. So when he was talking in conversation, did he have to reach in and know to hit the right button? The record button is up on top here, and not to hit the playback button, which is right below it. Otherwise, you might mistakenly start playing back something on the tape, and the person would all of a sudden hear and realize that you're doing something you shouldn't be doing. So it implies that he would have probably had to premeditate it and practice it in his garage, maybe a week ahead of time. And that led to visions of the TV series The Americans that just terminated. It reminds me of some scenes out of that series where they're in their garage practicing to do stuff. Was Michael Cohen in his garage with his microcassette player in his jacket pocket, breast pocket inside, and was he practicing how to hit the record button so that he could surreptitiously start the recording? And then the question I have is, would he then have to know that because he put a 60-minute tape in the machine and it's 30 minutes on a side, would he keep having to check his watch as he's talking to Mr. Trump, and when it gets down there like 29 minutes, he has to say suddenly, "Oh, excuse me, Mr. Trump, I have to go to the restroom." He would have to go to the restroom so he can stop the tape and then flip it over like that. And then he could start the recording again, put it back in his pocket, go back out, and continue the conversation. You know, it's just the mechanics of, was he really using tape? And if so, he would have had to have been practiced at it. You know, you have to suspend your disbelief here for a minute. Of course, he probably wasn't using tape. He was using, most likely, his phone. Although that raises a whole other set of questions, like what app would you actually use to record, to make your phone into a field recorder, a digital field recorder? I'm sure there's plenty of apps out there. I've just never done it, but there is some app, and that would be the most convenient way to do it. But there's also been reports out here in the media about these supposed tapes have been edited or altered. Parts of the conversation have been taken out. Now that is an interesting question, because assuming he did record some digital files on his phone, and it also depends on what kind of phone he has, whether it's an iOS device or Android. Think about what it would be required in order to edit those files, those tapes, after the fact, in order to remove parts of them. You would have to, I think, be using a dedicated audio editing program. If it was an iOS device, you could do something as simple as GarageBand, which comes pre-loaded on iOS devices. You could import the audio clip in GarageBand, and you could probably edit out something. But there's also other kinds of audio editing programs that are really more adept at editing audio. There's some that are dedicated for kind of like radio production kind of use, the kind of radio programming you would hear on the NPR and podcasting editing kind of program you could imagine. So this side of the story gets to the question of premeditation and skill and expertise at audio recording and audio editing. Now, some of the reports I read suggested that Mr. Cohen was used to doing this. He did a lot of audio recording using his phone, recording conversations on purpose, maybe as a note-taking device, so he could recall what the conversation was about afterwards. So it's very possible he was at least experienced at that. But I'm interested in the part about the editing part of it, because I have visions of Gene Hackman in playing the role of Harry Call in the movie The Conversation, Francis Ford Coppola's masterpiece. And I see Harry Call sitting there at his workbench with the reel-to-reel tape recorder and his special electronic mixing equipment, and running the tape back and forward and trying to sift out those voices from the background noise in the recording that was made in the public plaza. And I'm trying to picture Michael Cohen in that situation with on his computer, maybe working some program like Hindenburg or some other podcasting radio audio editing program, trying to edit out certain excerpts out of these tapes. That's part of the story I'm trying to tell. I don't know how to tell it, but that's what I'm imagining when I hear news reporters on TV saying the Michael Cohen tapes. Really? Is he really adept? Was he really adept at audio editing? Because if not, you know, if he had to transfer these files, email them or FTP them or whatever to some expert in audio editing, then you have a conspiracy. There's this thing I noticed when I was doing a little background research for this video, that there is a revival going on of interest in cassette tape, compact cassette tape. And that surprised me. Shouldn't have surprised me because I'm a typewriter guy, and of course I'm well familiar with the typewriter revival going on. So there's obviously other forms of antiquated media that are being rediscovered and repurposed nowadays, and among those are compact cassettes. So there are some artists that are releasing a new work on cassette tape. There are a lot of independent artists that for years have been releasing work on cassette tape, directly to tape. There is a company out of Springfield, Missouri called the National Audio Company that is one of the few magnetic tape, compact cassette tape manufacturers left. And if you're like a band and you have your whole album as a digital file, and if you have artwork already prepared for the J-sleeve, the paper jacket of the cassette album, you can send all that stuff to them and then order however many tapes you want, and they'll manufacture these finished tape albums for you. And the other interesting thing about this, there's this whole subculture that's sort of the part of the urban movement of the 1970s. It was the mixtape movement, and it kind of intersected with punk rock scene, the skater culture, the hip-hop culture, and it was all about copying pre-recorded music or recording it off the radio, making your own mixtapes, trading your own mixtapes with other people. And there's a whole aesthetic of mixtapes, these old tapes with worn, grungy old labels and kind of uniquely made, personalized tapes that are just, they're collectible now. People are starting to collect these things. They're an artifact from another age, another time, the 1970s and 80s. But people are getting back into mixtapes also. Part of the reason might be that there is probably a backlash from this highly controlled digital media that we live in, where the business model is that you will purchase MP3s, purchase music from a provider into your phone, and those will be managed for you, and you don't really own the music. You sort of just rent the music in a sense. Or people want to have more of a sense of ownership, like when back in the old days when you would buy an album on vinyl, you could copy it onto cassette tape. That's frequently was what we did back in the 70s when you had a hi-fi system, a stereo system, is you only played the vinyl record a few times because you wanted to preserve it. But one of those times that you played it when it was brand new is you made a copy onto a really good grade of cassette, like a metal tape or something, and then you played the tape to actually enjoy the album. And so people kind of want a sense of ownership over the music they buy. It's like if I buy a physical book, why can't I give the book away to somebody? Why can't I let somebody borrow my book? And you can see with ebooks, they want to treat ebook files like they do digital music files. No, you can't give somebody your ebook. You can't let them borrow it unless you gave them your ebook reader, but you can't let them take the file. So people want a sense of control over their musical experience, and that's part of the reason why they like cassette tapes, because they operate in the analog domain. It's really difficult to keep people from copying things from digital to analog tape, simply because you have to listen to the digital file in the analog realm with speakers or headphones. And with those kind of output jacks, you can feed into, obviously, an analog tape machine. So the other side of this revival of interest in cassette tape involves the equipment. There are some medium grade component kind of cassette decks that would be part of a stereo system. There are some new ones being made. They're not as good as the really high-end old ones, which are in premium demand, like your Nakamichis and other high-end ones. And of course, with high-end audio, there's no limit to how high-end you can get. You can go down the rabbit hole so to speak. In practical terms, there are some pretty good machines out there that can give you really good quality audio for music. And then there are the portable players, the so-called Walkman. And among the category of Walkman players, there are a few that recorded, and there are a few that had really good noise reduction, like Dolby noise reduction on them as a recording medium. Sony made a number of good portable field recorders for use by the press for people doing mobile recording, and those are considered really good machines if you can get them in good working order. But again, they're old, and a lot of them have rubber belts, and the rubber parts need to be replaced. And so that's always a problem with these old pieces of equipment, is maintenance. And finally, there are the new machines that you can buy on the order of like these inexpensive compact cassette players. There are some boom boxes, some new boom boxes coming out that have a tuner, a radio tuner and all that. And there's a few inexpensive, well, quite a few inexpensive cassette players out there that will automatically convert to MP3 within the player itself. The quality of the A to D converters in those machines is questionable, of course, just like the quality of the recording in these kind of machines. These are bare bones, bottom of the line units. This is not really music grade quality, these machines. These are really equivalent to a little bit better than micro cassette, I would say. So that's kind of where the technology is right now. It's like typewriters. They don't make new typewriters that are any good. There's a few manual, cheap, really poorly made manual typewriters. And there are some fairly okay electronic typewriters, the daisy wheel plastic wedge type of typewriters. But generally, for manual typewriters, you have to buy a used typewriter and get it serviced and fixed up. And that's kind of the state of the art of cassette tape, compact cassette tape as well. If you want a really good compact cassette tape recorder, you're going to have to get an old one to get it serviced and get it up to snuff. So part of this story about tape has been about the way we use terminology and language. The word tape is obviously misapplied by the media, by the news media, when they're referring to audio recordings made off someone's phone, for instance. But it's common to also see other terminologies misused, like we say, I filmed the birthday party with my phone, for instance, where the phone isn't really using film. These are common terms of media that come to be used widely, like some regions in the United States use the word Coke to refer to any soft drink. Any carbonated soft drink is a Coke. Hand me a Coke. What kind of Coke would you like? Oh, I'll take a Pepsi. I'll take a Sprite. We say, hand me a Kleenex. And it's not really the Kleenex brand. It's like some store's, house brand. Jell-O. Any gelatinous dessert is going to be Jell-O, whether it's Jell-O brand or not. So this is kind of the branding, how branding becomes so common that we use these words interchangeably, and that's, I think, the way it is with tape. But it does remind me, though, whenever I hear the word tape used in the media to refer to audio recordings, I can't help but think of these devices and these little guys right here, tape. It is often not a question of fidelity, because this is the same kind of question we get presented with typewriters. Why do you want to use a typewriter when you can write in a computer? We're always asked that question as typewriter aficionados. And the answer has little to do with the efficiency of writing in a computer versus typing. It's always about, there's other attributes of typing that you don't get with word processing. And I think there's some aspect of that that's true also with tape. Tape is a secure medium. If you keep it in the analog domain, keep it off the damn computer, in other words, it's secure, it is personal, it is private. It can be shared, easy. The tapes themselves are very rugged, more rugged than an optical, like a CD or DVD disc. Cassette tapes will just hold up the last. They can be repaired. If your machine eats the tape, you can splice the damn tape and keep using it, actually. In the dilemma I had in trying to make this story happen and trying to figure out really what the story is, I finally realized what it is only after doing this final edit. And the story really is that Mr. Cohen and myself have a lot in common. We've both been interested for a long time, apparently, in audio recordings of voice. That's what Mr. Cohen appears to have been doing, recording conversations. I've been interested in recording voice and conversations since I was a kid. Now, our motivations are perhaps different. Most likely they are. And I'm not saying that that makes Mr. Cohen a good guy, and I'm not saying that makes me a bad guy. But I think that's the story, is we have something in common here. You know, we both like audio, we both like recording voice, and I like listening to radio stories and podcasts also. So that's the story I'm trying to tell in this video. I was unable to really make this any other way, but it's a multifaceted story. The word tape is being used in the news media. There is a cassette tape revival. I have a personal interest in tape historically in my life, and also as an ongoing medium of personal expression. And that's the tape story. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Hope this gave you some ideas. Until next time, have a good day.